general psych and brain and behavior. So this is the entire freshman class. They're first year students, first semester, first year students, and they're here as enthusiastic as I am, I'm sure, to hear your presentation on synesthesia. I guess I can start by, let me just probably give everyone a rundown of how things are going to go today. So we'll first listen to Dr. Pru's presentation, and then should we just play it by ear, Dr. Pru, how long it takes, and then how long we're going to designate? So the whole session should take about 1 hour and 30 minutes. So whatever time we have left after the presentation, we're going to open the forum for a question and answer session. And as students, you are welcome to unmute your microphone and ask, but of course, please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Or for those of you who are uncomfortable asking the question in English, you may type your question in Indonesian in the chat box, and I'll be sure to translate it for Dr. Pru to answer. So let me first introduce Dr. Pru to the audience. Dr. Pru, with us today is Dr. Pru, Dr. Michael Pru, who is, please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Pru, this is the information I got from your CV, who is an associate professor in cognitive science in the Department of Psychology at the University of Bath in the United Kingdom. He also serves as a visiting senior lecturer in the Queen Mary University of London. Dr. Pru is also currently actively involved as a visiting researcher in the AR/VR, I assume it's augmented reality and virtual reality labs research in MEDA, or what you probably previously, the students here are probably more familiar with Facebook, but Facebook renamed, or they have this brand new identity, and it's called Meta. So basically, Dr. Pru is doing research for Facebook on augmented reality and virtual reality. As an expert in the fields of experimental and cognitive psychology, whose primary research focus is on visual perception and synesthesia, Dr. Pru is quite experienced in sharing his insights and expertise, as he has frequently been invited to give talks and keynote speeches in various institutions, conferences, and events across Europe and North America, mostly on the topics of visual and multi-sensor perceptions. So a brief summary of Dr. Pru's qualifications. Dr. Pru obtained his Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from Arizona State University, before obtaining his master's degree in psychology and a PhD in psychological and brain sciences, both from Johns Hopkins University. Following his doctoral education, he took up a postdoctoral fellow position in experimental biological psychology in the Institute of Experimental Psychology, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf, Germany, before pursuing a teaching and research career in the UK. Throughout his teaching career, Dr. Pru has organized and taught many university courses, including those in the psychology and neuroscience of blindness, quantitative research methods, and cognitive psychology, in addition to supervising numerous master's and PhD students, as well as postdoctoral fellows. As a prolific researcher, Dr. Pru has conducted an impressive number of studies on visual attention and perception, as well as on multisensory perception. Within the past 2 years alone, he has authored and co-authored more than 20 manuscripts published in various peer-reviewed scientific journals and proceedings, including the journal Attention, Perception, and Psychophysics, Neuropsychologia, Perception, Psychology, and Neuroscience, Cortex, and Frontiers in Psychology. I'm sure all of you are looking forward to listening to Dr. Pru's presentation. So without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Michael Pru to begin his presentation titled Synthetic Synesthesia, Seeing with the Eyes and Tongue. Dr. Pru, the stage is yours.
Terima kasih, Manda.
You're welcome.
Selamat pagi, everyone. It is night here, but I know it's morning there, and I hope you're all doing well. Let me get my screen sharing ready to go here. So you might see me looking away sometimes. That's because I have two screens here. So take a look at my slides when necessary.
That's all right.
And make sure I can share my sound with you.
Yep, we can see your screen.
Great. Okay, so as Amanda mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about a form of multisensory perception known as synesthesia, but from a different perspective than you might normally get in much synesthesia research, because I will be focusing in particular on applications of synesthesia that are interesting to me, which is why I've titled this synthetic synesthesia, or a form of sort of artificial synesthesia, because I have a particular application I'm interested in, which is creating assistive technology for people with sensory impairments, such as blindness. And so some of that assistive technology I work with is a form of augmented reality, here that I describe as essentially seeing with the eyes and the tongue for some of the technologies we have been working with. Now, a lot of this work I'm going to be describing comes from work we've conducted in my cross-modal cognition lab at the University of Bath, which has been conducted with a large team of fantastic scientists, including undergraduate students, like many of you, postgraduate students, such as master's and doctoral students, postdoctoral fellows, and other assistant professors and associate professors at the university in both psychology and in computer science. So we have a few people who are around the lab the day we took photos. And this is in front of our psychology building at the University of Bath, where they put up a nice poster showing off some of the work that we conducted on seeing with sound in particular. A lot of this work has also been done in collaboration with others, including the other university in Bath, Bath Spa University, and through our various research centers that have funded our work. And as was mentioned, I am currently on a 2-year sabbatical in America, working at what was Facebook Reality Labs when I got here, but now is known as Meta, the new parent company that controls Reality Labs research, which came out of the creation of the Oculus virtual reality headsets. So if you've experienced virtual reality, there's a good chance it's one of the Oculus headsets. The Quest 2 is the current one that's widely available. Prior ones were the Rift, which was one of the first consumer level virtual reality headsets that were created. And now I'm working to help with the strategic design of research plans to try and take advantage of what we psychologists know about human perception and the perception action loop in order to make these new technologies even better and something that we can use in the near future rather than sort of far off in the, sort of science fiction type future that might be ahead of us. Now I'm going to pose a bunch of questions during the talk. And so incidentally, a number of these might be rhetorical in a sense. But if at any point during the talk, you have an urgent question, if there's something that really needs to be clarified, or if there's something I say that you don't know what it means, please do feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat. And hopefully Amanda or someone else can bring it to my attention, and I'll try and handle any questions that come up along the way. So do feel free to take advantage of that, just so things can be clarified as we go. So the first question, what does it mean to see? So in some ways, that seems like a simple question, right? You could ask a child, what does it mean to see? And get some interesting responses. You can ask a scientist, and they might give a slightly different response. If you ask different kinds of scientists, so a psychologist versus someone who studies physics and optics, might give a slightly different response. But what seems like such a simple question is actually a bit of an illusion because it's very complex. One way I like to think about the complexity of it is this memo from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, from 1966, so a very long time ago, even before I was born, where the artificial intelligence group saw vision as a summer project. So they thought with the enormous room-sized computers they had back in the 60s, that they could have a bunch of summer students solve the problem of allowing computers to have vision. Now we know now that they did not solve computer vision back in the 60s, and it's still an incredible problem today to get computers to be able to see as quickly and as effectively as we can. If anything, we take it for granted, those of us who can see, because it seems like it takes no effort. You open your eyes, and immediately it seems like you're able to recognize all the objects around you. You're able to tell the face of a stranger or someone you know very well. And it's just in milliseconds, you're able to process this information, and you're able to get some meaning out of what you're being able to see. So here, though, when they tried to look at computer vision, they had to define it, right? You had to think of, well, what does it mean to see? And their definition is interesting. Down here, it says pattern recognition. So they're at least thinking about trying to solve the problem of being able to recognize different patterns, which really a lot of vision is something like that. So you need some definition to start with, and that's something I want to establish first. Now, someone who came out of MIT, the late David Marr, wrote a great book a very long time ago, in 1982, called Vision, in which he proposed an answer to this question in order to write a book like that. He wrote, the plain man's answer, and Aristotle's too, would be to know what is where by looking. So if we unpack that a little bit, and there's sort of two key parts that he's describing, that you're getting information about what things are, and you're getting information about where they are. Now, if you thought of your own answer to this question, what does it mean to see? You can try and think about whether or not this captures what you might say. In some ways, it can capture a lot. It's a very simple question, being answered both philosophically and by a computer scientist here, Aristotle and David Marr. But it's a good starting point, because in many ways, to recognize the face of a loved one, like someone from your family, you need to be able to know where their face is and know what the different parts are and how they come together to make that face that you recognize. And so it gives us some key parts we can focus on. And this is incredibly important because the focus of my talk is thinking about how we can take an applied approach to synesthesia to help blind people access visual information. So the sorts of visual information we tend to focus on would be being able to identify things, to recognize things, knowing what they are, but knowing where things are as well. So being able to find where things are, or be able to find our way between different places. Now, of course, we don't just see. Really, the broader question that's important is the fact that we are a multisensory organism. So really what's important is, well, what does it mean to perceive? We see, hear, touch, taste, smell. We experience all of these senses in our brain, not in the external peripheral parts, not in the eyes, ears, fingers, mouth, or nose. The really interesting information processing is taking place in the brain. Now, that might seem really fundamental and simple, but it's really important, particularly if you're dealing with someone who has any kind of sensory deficit. Because a person who becomes blind because they've had their, say, retina within the eye damaged or their optic nerve damage, still has their brain able to process the information, but we need a way to get the information there. So an important idea is that if we're deprived of one sense, the other senses can compensate or even substitute for the missing sensory modality. So if we're unable to see, how can we take advantage of what we're able to hear or what we're able to feel to access the sort of information we normally get through vision? So where are we going? So the sort of main points I'm going to cover in this talk is first describing in some ways how visual impairments inspired my research into atypical forms of augmented reality and virtual reality. So taking advantage of the sorts of technology we're developing to create a way of presenting different information to our senses, but to make it useful for people who could really use it to access the world that they have trouble accessing. So in the case of sensory impairments, for example. And so the particular way that's done is through sensory substitution and augmentation. So either using one sense to substitute for another, or adding additional sensory information that we can process as a means of understanding fundamental processes in psychology. Things like information processing and capacity limitations, and multisensory integration and cooperation. So it's just important to keep in mind that our experience of the world and ourselves is multisensory. You know, we tend to think of primates in general, so humans, orangutans, monkeys, as all being very visual species. And the idea is that a lot of our brain is dedicated to processing visual information. And vision is very important to us. Those of us who have vision are able to do incredible things with it. But it really is just feeding into our other senses that tell us so much about the world, particularly if you can think about moving from one place to another and the information you get from proprioception and kinesthesia. So the movement of your limbs in space and your knowledge about where they are is integrated with vision in order to interact with the world. And so this brings me to synesthesia, a very compelling case of multisensory perception that often is seen as exceptional. But I think the basic idea really extends to all of us. First, the exceptional part though. So synesthesia is an experience that a small percentage of the population has. There are estimates where anywhere from 3 to 7% of the population might have synesthesia. However, most people aren't aware of it. I mean, if I think about this audience right now, with having, it looks like over 200 of us gathered right now, it's likely that there are several people here who have synesthesia, some of whom might know they do, and some of whom might have no idea because it's just the way they experience the world. So its definition is that it's someone who has a concurrent experience. So an experience at exactly the same time of a sensation that's induced by external stimulation of another sensation. So the idea is that you have something happening out there in the world that you sense, and it triggers a different sensation, either within the same sensory modality. So you might see something and you'll experience visually something else, or it can trigger something cross-modally. So it can cross over to a different sensory modality and trigger something in that. An example there is you might actually hear music playing, but then have a visual experience that is induced by the music playing. Let me give a couple of examples. One example, which is probably the most well studied in psychology, is the case where people see numbers and letters as color. So here are some example colored numbers seen by a particular person, the initials WO, and they were tested on 2 separate occasions to see that they're consistent in their experience. And for this person, whenever they see black letters and numbers. So sort of like along the top here. In case you didn't know, these are all black letters at the top of the slide that say, what is synesthesia? If they look colored to you, you might have synesthesia. But because a person with synesthesia, this type, automatically has colors associated with each of the letters or the words, or in this case, with numbers. And so every time they see them, it's like they see these colors projected on top, or they have a very strong perception of these colors in their mind's eye whenever they see these letters or numbers. So that's also this example here. So now you have a look at the brain where you can look at an area related to letter recognition, say along the fusiform gyrus. And that is very close to an area of the brain known as visual area 4, V4, which is known for color processing and among other things like object perception. And the idea is that you have these interactions between the area that recognizes the letter K, which triggers a consistent response that allows the person to see it as a color, in this case, red. But as I mentioned earlier on, you can also have it cross over to different senses, such that hearing a word or hearing music might trigger another association. The example here is one person who, when hearing a word like car, experiences the flavor of broccoli. Probably more famous would be some musicians, a fair number of musicians and artists, such as painters, who, when they hear music, they see colored shapes. For example, there is the painter Kandinsky, who makes a sort of modern abstract art with lots of different colored shapes. And many of Kandinsky's paintings are named after the music that inspired them, such that as the music was heard, the shapes would be in the mind's eye, and then Kandinsky painted the colors and shapes that were seen. So you could share them with us. Others, so there's the musician known as Pharrell Williams, had a really popular song, Happy. And he's known as a synesthete. So he knows a song is perfect, and he knows a song is done when the colored shapes he sees evoked by it are beautiful to him. So listening to music, his own music, creates these visual things that he can see in his mind's eye. And a lot of research has shown that these are truly perceptually experienced. So they've done a lot of very basic perceptual tests that have shown that people are able to take advantage of their experiences, such as seeing colored numbers, to be able to find them more quickly. So, you know, if you had to look through a whole list of numbers, say in a spreadsheet, if you had to do some data analysis, if you know you're looking for the green number, you can quickly find it. Whereas a person who's looking for the shape of the number would have a really hard time doing that. But what I'm interested in, so I think that the phenomenon of synesthesia is super fascinating. And if anyone out there is a synesthete or just discovered they are one, is something you should look into, because the research is really incredible, particularly in the way synesthetes can use their synesthesia either to be creative or to improve their memory or to improve their perception. But I think synesthesia is also something that we can potentially take advantage of more widely. And that's because there are a lot of cases where we know there's acquired synesthesia. So most synesthetes we study are born synesthetes. We know it's genetic. It seems like it's more likely passed on along the female side of the family. And so people are born with it, and then it sort of develops as they develop, and then they start experiencing this crossover of the senses. But some people can't acquire it. So in some cases, such as sensory deprivation, so there have been people who lost their vision, became blind, and then developed synesthesia. A couple of good examples are people who lost their vision and then found that they developed an experience of touch. So they would touch different fabrics or surfaces, like this hard desk here, and colors and colored shapes would come to their mind. So touch would induce a visual experience for them. Others have used hypnosis. So there's been a couple of fascinating studies where people were hypnotized and given the suggestion that certain letters and numbers had colors. And then when they were perceptually tested, it absolutely seemed like they had synesthesia after hypnosis. And so the question I propose is, can it be induced in a controlled manner to assist the blind? So is there a way to give some blind people who have this way to use their other senses, such as hearing and touch, to induce visual images in their brain as a function of this crossing over of the senses? And it's something I've written about in a number of papers, with one example here from Consciousness and Cognition. So let's take a step back into the world again. So here, this is an image from near where I grew up. So I'm originally from Arizona, which is in the southwest portion of the United States, before I started moving around the world. And a beautiful place, lots of forests, mountains, rivers, creeks. And I like this image, first because it reminds me of home, but also just because it captures the richness of the visual world that those of us who are sighted know so well. The colors, the orientations, the patterns, textures, shapes, reflections. There's so much information out there in the world. And as Manda mentioned, a lot of my publications and work have focused on how we deal with the overload of visual information we might be faced with. You know, if I think about, well, for example, in Jakarta, near where you are studying, the roads there are amazing. So many cars coming from every direction, so many motorbikes. You know, the amount of visual movement and shapes and colors on your roadways as people are trying to get from one side of Jakarta to another was just such an incredible experience. You know, so much information. How do we handle so much information all at once? Well, fortunately, we have things like attention, which allow us to be perceptually selective and only process certain parts of what we can see at a time. But then as I advanced in my career, I became really interested in the case of not having visual information and what that can reveal to us about the brain. In particular, working with people with severe visual impairments where they have profound blindness. So they might have some light detection, but otherwise are unable to see any form at all. And in a lot of the work, which I'm not going to be going into too much today, that we've published, has looked at doing comparisons between people who are born blind versus those who become blind when they're older, in order to understand developmental psychology. So whether there are critical periods where people need to experience vision in order to fully develop any sort of cognitive or psychological processes. And usually if I'm having a discussion with someone about this kind of work, the thing I ask them at this point is, if they were to become visually impaired, what would you miss? And the answers people give me are always amazing. I mean, so some people miss a lot of things that we can take for granted, like reading a book, watching a film, being able to see it, not just hear it, being able to easily see and navigate your way from one point to another, missing the face of someone like a family member, you know, and there's all these sort of rich things that, if you think back to that quote by David Marr, you know, what it means to see. Yes, you could define seeing as what is where, but really what's important to us about seeing are all these emotional things that make those things important to us. You know, so it's not a matter of just knowing that a face is somewhere, but whose face it is, that it's someone who's important to you, and being able to see that and experience that. It could be like the natural scene I showed you earlier, or a sunset, you know, something which is just moving and emotional. And so vision can be very important for those things too. So how can we take advantage of something like synesthesia and provide visual experience to those without it. And this is this idea of sensory substitution, allowing one sense to substitute for the missing one. And to do that with technology, such as augmented reality devices. And so the examples I'm going to give you are seeing with sound, with your ears, or seeing with touch via the tongue. Here's just an example with a news article that's still available describing some of our work on seeing with sound in particular. Okay, so back to the psychology side of things. If we want to turn images into something that a blind person can access, we have an enormous sensory information processing challenge. Because an image, I don't know if you have the saying in Bahasa Indonesia, that an image is worth 1,000 words. A very common saying people say all the time here. And you can think about how being able to show a photograph of something can capture much more than you can describe in just a sentence. And we can look at this also from the perspective of the amount of information our sensory organs process and that are processed by our brain. So in vision is so important to primates like us, like humans, because it gives us such great spatial acuity. And with that spatial acuity, we can pick up on information that is silent and far away. Now you can have information about things that are light years away. If you think about the stars that you might be able to see in the sky, you're getting information that's incredibly far away, and vision's able to give it to us. And you can even see a star, even though it's super tiny. We have good spatial acuity for being able to locate it and see it. So some estimates using information theoretic models suggest that we're able to process on the order of 4.3 times 10 to the 6th bits per second. So a lot of computational information when we open our eyes. And we're largely able to do that in parallel. So for example, if you were to go to watch a soccer match, let's say the national team of Indonesia is playing and they have red shirts on, maybe white shorts, you're able to process the movement of the players wearing red in parallel, even amongst the other team. Let's say if they're wearing all white shirts, you can pick up on the information in parallel and rapidly be able to move your eyes from one to another because of your ability to do that. So in parallel meaning all at once. But let's compare that with the tactile perception, touch. So in many ways, touch makes sense as a good approach to help a blind person see. I'm sure many of you are aware of Braille. So the little bumps you can print on paper so people are able to interpret the bumps as letters. Or perhaps maybe as a child, you might have played a game where you close your eyes and you can draw letters on the hand or maybe the arm of a friend and see if they can recognize them. And as long as you draw the letter at a decent size, people can. They can, here I'm just tracing an A on my hand, for example, and I can feel it very clearly. And it makes sense because the retina is essentially a surface of skin in the back of the eye, and it's two-dimensional. We're able to see 3D with two eyes, but it's basically just two-dimensional, just like the surface of your skin. So it seems to make sense. The problem is it's lower acuity. So you're not able to pick up on such fine details. You can do a bunch of tests by like having a person try to tell when you're touching them with one finger versus two by bringing them closer together or further apart. And on some parts of the body, say like the elbow, they have to be really far apart to tell that there's two. We're definitely not as sensitive everywhere. The way we can see that, if we calculate it in terms of bits per second, is far smaller. So only 100 bits per second versus the enormous amount we can process with vision. And we can't really do things in parallel. It's very serial. So you can't really tell if someone's touching this hand and your shoulder at the same time. You pretty much have to shift attention from one to the other. But it's a start. And it was a start all the way in the 1960s. So Paul Baccarita and colleagues develop a way of substituting vision with touch, initially using an enormous chair where you'd feel pins on your back, they press out into your back as pixels in an image. And so this camera here above the chair would take a black and white photograph, and the white regions would cause the pins to push up into your back. The black ones, it would remain down. And so people were able to experience these images on their back, and they could understand them. They could tell shapes, they could respond to movement, they could essentially see with their backs in this case. Now, clearly, you can't carry a big chair around with you, so it had some limitations. And so this group and others kept working on developing a smaller portable device, which eventually became what is now called the brain port. And the brain port, one of the original devices they would sell to blind people is down here, where they 3D printed a computer device, which you would plug into sunglasses that have a small webcam in the bridge of the nose. So you basically gain visual information from near your eyes, process it by the computer, and then this part over here goes on your tongue. So you would see with images on your tongue. This is better than the back, primarily because the tongue is much more sensitive. And also because the tongue is generally wet, and so therefore it's conductive for electricity. So the way it works is it actually puts out a very small voltage of electricity to little pixels on your tongue. And through that, you're able to feel the pixels of the images on your tongue, or something that's moving in front of the camera or coming towards you. You can feel all of that on your tongue. And the closest, I don't know if anyone's had this, they sometimes sell this thing that's popping candy. So it's a candy where inside the sugar, you have a little bit of carbon dioxide, which when it hits the tongue, makes the candy pop open. And you feel this sort of little popping on your tongue. And the image feels a bit like that. You have this sort of stimulation going across the tongue with whatever you're able to see in front of the camera. So one thing we wanted to explore in some recent work, so I'm going to be telling you about some work that we've only done in just the last couple of years, was to understand this problem of the skin as a spatial analog to the retina. Well, why is it a problem? Well, the tongue is down here and flat. So you're presenting information on top of it. But the camera is up here. And like your eyes, the information is not at this horizontal level, but vertical. And so you're having to process information from a camera that comes in this way, but then you're feeling it this way. So you have to make kind of a transformation between the two presentations. And so something we did recently was explore this using ambiguous stimuli. By ambiguous stimuli, I mean stimuli that can be perceived in different ways depending on which way you look at it. So one example here are these letters. So this is the lowercase letter p, a lowercase q, a lowercase b, and a lowercase d. Now, visually, if you see these flat on a screen, they don't seem ambiguous. But it depends on your perspective, particularly if suddenly this image is taken in by a camera and placed onto your tongue. So as you're trying to interpret it on your tongue, you suddenly have an interesting problem. Which way do you read your tongue? So the display puts the top of the letter P here at the back of the mouth, and you could read it either from a perspective of looking down onto your tongue. So if you imagine your eyes are looking onto your tongue and trying to read what it looks like there, in which case it would look like the letter B. You could instead read up through your tongue and see the letter presented there, and then imagine it as intended as a letter P. Or you can also take the perspective of others. So something we're very good at, and maybe if you've heard of something like theory of mind or other studies of perspective taking, where many people are able to take the perspective of someone else. And instead, because it's down here on your tongue, you might imagine what it looks like to someone facing it, which then, if they're facing it from above, it would look like the letter Q. Or if they're facing it from below, it would look like the letter D. So it can be potentially really confusing. And we're really interested in the basic way and individual differences in that. So what we end up finding is it was absolutely seen as ambiguous, and it depended on what we presented to them. Because we didn't just present these letters, we also presented arrows, oriented lines, and then we rotated the letters so that way it would be more ambiguous than normal. Importantly, when we look at letters, for example, most people saw it from this perspective of reading up through their tongue from below, but not everyone. And I know you're studying personality to some extent. We found some correlations between the personality type of a person and the perspective they use for reading the letters on their tongue. If we look at other stimuli, such as arrows, we found a much more mixed perspective where people were actually inconsistent and would change their mind. So they might read their tongue from one direction, but then switch to another, depending on which arrow was presented to them. And so in many ways, we realized, and now this PhD student in the middle here, Mike Richardson, has started taking a look more in depth at basic sensory processing of the tongue, because we actually know very little about it, surprisingly. Much research in sensory psychology has focused on vision through the eyes, touch on the fingers, but even though our tongues are so important to us for eating and for speaking, we know very little of the sensory properties. And so now we're doing more research specifically to try and understand these individual differences and how we're able to perceive with it. Okay, so that's through touch. Another approach which came about later was auditory. So working through sound. And there are good reasons to think about doing things through sound rather than touch. One is our temporal acuity. Our ability to differentiate timing is very good. And you can think about that in terms of music, where you're able to pick up on very small intervals between the notes that you might hear when an instrument is playing or in a song you might like. Hearing can also process more information than touch. So instead of 10 to the second power, 10 to the fourth power bits per second. But here's why no one did this earlier. Well, how can we provide visual spatial information through sound? On touch, it makes sense. The retina is like skin, and you can just present things in a way you can feel. But how can you present an image that you can hear? Well, this goes back to thinking about synesthesia. So synesthesia, again, is the case where people hear things like music and then see colored shapes. But that's a small percentage of the population. Is there a way we can induce that more generally, particularly in someone who has lost their vision? Well, let's think about this. So perhaps you've seen this example before, and that's okay if you have. If you want, you can put an answer in the chat. There are two shapes here, and each shape has a name. One of these shapes is called Kiki, and one of these shapes is called Booba. Now, I would like you to guess which is the name of this first shape here. Would you say it's Kiki or Booba? It doesn't matter how you spell it, just take a guess there. Okay, a lot of votes are coming in. They're going by pretty fast, but as far as I can see so far, it seems like Booba is the most popular among everyone who's responded so far. And that is consistent with most people. So over 90% of the people name this object as Kiki and name the other shape as Booba, just like your responses here. So it's always good when the example works out well with a different audience. And when I say 90% of people, this is cross-culturally. So this actually here is some colleagues I collaborate with in Japan, Toyohashi University of Technology, collecting data with people in northern Malaysia, up near the border with Thailand, and finding exactly the same result with them. People have looked at this in sub-Saharan Africa with people who live more traditionally and found similar results with them. There seems to be this cross-modal correspondence, this connection between what we see and the name that we hear. So hearing booba is more likely to bring this shape to mind with its soft curves here. And hearing kiki, that sound, matches the sharp-edged object that you see over here. So in some ways, even if you didn't think you were a synesthete at the beginning of this talk, all of us have a form of synesthesia in this sense through these cross-modal correspondences. We have a lot of connections between our senses that just haven't always been discovered yet. So the question is, can we take advantage of that? Can we use these cross-modal correspondences to allow us to get from an image to a sound? Well, with Booba Kiki, we know we can, but what about an image like this? So this is a photograph of the Himalayas taken by a blind person that I know, Pranav Lal, who lives in India. And even though he's profoundly blind, he uses technology to help him take photographs and share his photographs with the world. So he took this photograph. But the important thing is when we look at a complex image like this is to remember that we can reduce it to information. And the easiest way we do that is through creating these pixels throughout the image, where we have different regions that we split it into. And then we can think of, well, how can we translate these pixels into a cross-modal correspondence? Well, let's think about the information there. Let's start with this pixel up here. So it's high up in the image. It's to the right of the image. And its luminance is very bright. So that's that one there. Now contrast that with this one down here. It's low in the image, it's to the left, and it's much darker. So we just need to find a way to translate that information and then see if that works. Well, going back on research almost 100 years ago, people have found links between sounds and spaces that we can see. One such area of research, going back to the 1930s, found that if you play people different notes, so you might have a high frequency note, which we hear as a high pitch, and people tend to associate that with high locations. If you play a low note, a low pitch, people associate that with lower locations. Plus, the brightness of the pixels, people automatically associate a bright light with a loud noise and darkness with quiet. So it's two parts. The other part, if you think about the left and right, well, in hearing, we naturally associate sounds on the left, of course, with looking to the left to see where the sound is coming from, sounds on the right with looking to the right. And so if we can present sounds spatially, then we can capture that aspect of the information too. But we solve this problem that vision in an image has 1,000 words. It's too much information. If you remember, our auditory processing can only handle 10 to the 4 bits per second, whereas in vision, we're only processing 4.3 times 10 to the 6 bits per second. So to help cut down the information a bit, another thing we can do is only present part of the image at a time. And we do that with a device called the voice, where we only play one column of pixels at a time from left to right. So you only hear one column as you go, in order to give yourself more time to integrate the information that you hear that's represented in the image. So that might seem a little abstract. So we're going to go through a few examples. First, with a video we made for New Scientist magazine, alongside Pranav's wonderful photographs of his travels, his sonic holiday snaps, where he uses this device that turns images into sound to help him direct the camera and take the photograph. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this all right. And hopefully it won't be too loud or too quiet. We'll see. So just to make sure, hopefully you heard a high-pitched sound representing a line that's high in the air, and then a low-pitched sound representing a line that's lower. And remember, it's scanning from left to right. So you're having silence, then the sound is on, high or low, and then silence again. Now you'll hear the left to right difference much more clearly when we introduce an oriented line. So the line goes up from left to right. So the pitch you hear goes up, goes from a low note to a high note, essentially. Let's hear it if it's going down the other way. So in that case, again, it's going from left to right. And so you hear it start high and then go to a lower frequency. But now, again, the real world is more complicated than simple oriented lines. Here are some examples of what Pranav hears. So it sounds really complicated. This one, I think, almost sounds like the water that's actually portrayed in the image, but that's just because of the many rocks and the change in brightness that you hear. But something I think you can tell in these images is a bit like those oriented lines. In this one, I think you can hear the sound kind of going from high pitch to low pitch. And in this one, you can hear it going from low to high, just like those oriented lines. So let's just hear those again. It's repeating. Now you can hear it go up. This one, you hear the sound going both up and down as it curves, picking up on the brightness of the clouds. This one's going down again. And that one's clearly down. You can hear it both going up and down. And people with very little training can pick up on these basic shapes really well. Pranav has been using it for about 10 years now. So he's developed an expertise that goes beyond simple shapes, and it's what allows him to take such well-aimed photographs too. Just some other examples to be able to hear sort of simple shapes based on real things. Not far from where I am a professor in Bath is London, and this is the London Eye. Just playing twice. You hear it going kind of up and down, which seems to have almost like a booba sound to people, a round sound to it. Here, of course, is the Eiffel Tower in Paris, which will have a much sort of sharper sense to it. And you can kind of hear it really quickly go up and down again. So very quickly, you kind of hear it go quickly up and down really quick. So you can get a sense of it, particularly for more complex images, and how someone like Pranav might be able to use this and to have a sort of image in his mind that is correlated to the sound that he's hearing. It's like having this concurrent experience of a mental image based on a sound that's presented to him. Now, what can you do with it? Well, lots of things. So in some ways, being able to recognize, say, the London Eye or the Eiffel Tower is a matter of knowing what something is. But this example here from one of my older papers, first studying sensory substitution, was how well people could handle where tasks. So specifically, could people identify the location of objects? Here, a very small plastic box on this table, and be able to translate that information to natural motor movements. So obviously, when we have visual information, such as being able to see my cup of tea here, we need to be able to accurately get ourselves to the location of being able to grasp it. And as you see here, this person who trained for a week with the voice was able to do this incredibly accurately. I mean, look at the size of the hand, which is entirely appropriate for the object, and goes straight to it. So he is getting this sort of sense in his mind's eye based on the sound of what is there, where it is, and is able to interact with it appropriately. We've also been looking this on larger scales, so things like navigation and wayfinding and obstacle avoidance. So here we have a person, they actually just trained for 30 minutes before trying this sort of active movement task, trying to be able to have this visual-like control of their action based on hearing the environment around them through the camera that's in the glasses over their blindfold. So those are some of the applications we're able to do building on this form of synthetic synesthesia. But I want to get back to some more of the psychology side of it. In particular, if you remember at the beginning of the talk, I showed you a picture of my native Arizona, you know, this outdoor scene with red rocks, green trees, reflective water below. And I described how that can remind us of how the environment can have a lot more information than we can handle. The roads in Jakarta were the example I gave, which can be this overwhelming amount of visual information with all the motorbikes and cars and people going around you at fast speeds. So we have all these capacity limits, and these are very well understood in vision and how we use attention, and we're able to learn to overcome them to some extent. So we've also examined this in the case of sensory substitution, in particular, turning these images into sound and trying to understand whether we have the same fundamental limits on how much information we can process and what the solutions might be for dealing with that. And this is done by my former PhD student, Dave Brown, who's now an assistant professor in the United Kingdom. So the way we examine this is very similar to classic studies in vision that looked at this, going back to the 1970s even. So Atkinson and Schifrin, two sort of big cognitive psychologists in the United States back then. They examined this by seeing what happens if you present information simultaneously. So you're presented with all the information at once, versus having it successively. So having part of it shown and then another part shown, so you can process just some of it and then the rest of it. And so in the simultaneous condition, in some ways you could think people might perform better because they're presented with the whole image twice. But and that's simultaneous. In the successive condition, people are presented with one half and then the other half. So they actually only kind of get the whole image once versus having it twice in the simultaneous case. But if there are fundamental problems in terms of how much information we can process at a time, then it's possible performance will be better if they're only experiencing part of it each time rather than all of it all the time. So we did this using the voice. We translated these images into sound using those principles where high is a high sound, low in the image is a low sound, and you kind of hear it go from left to right each time. White is loud, black is dark. And what we found, and we tested them, of course, we had to have a way for them to match what they were hearing. And we had either people do this visually, so we would just have people who can see take part, and they would hear the sounds and match it to images. But then for blindness, people did this in terms of touch. So they would have cutouts of these images and they associate what they heard to what they could feel with their hands. So in this case, red is the touch case for blind people. Blue is the visual case. And so first of all, I think it's really interesting that performance was better for blind people using touch. So they were able to make this match between what they heard and what they were feeling with their fingers. That worked better than hearing it and matching it to images in sighted people. But the other important finding for information processing was that people did better when they only heard half of the object and then the other half. And they were worse when they were presented with the whole thing twice. And so this indicates that in all of our senses, we have a capacity limit, and we're better able to process it if we have less information presented at any given moment. So the less information you have to process all at the same time, the easier it is. And so actually splitting the image or splitting the image into sound help people perform better. So essentially, too much information can be a problem. It helps to actually reduce how much you present to a person. Actually, you can think of some good examples where people take advantage of this more generally. One example is where people do carriage rides with horses, for example. So one famous example that occurs to me is in New York City. If you watch a movie, like, I don't know if you've seen this movie called Elf, about a Christmas elf who goes to New York City. And they show how it's very famous in Central Park that people go for these carriage rides, where you have a carriage that's pulled by horses. And the horses are given these little blinders, which limit their vision to just what's in front of them. Because otherwise, having all the traffic rushing by the sides distract them would make it very difficult for them to move comfortably. So actually reducing their information helps them perform better. So is one solution information reduction? Instead of presenting as much information as possible, is it better to present less? Particularly again, because vision can handle a lot more information than hearing can. So in our paper, same student, along with a postdoctoral fellow in engineering, examined how much information we really need in order to be able to tell what objects are when we turn images into something else a blind person can access. Now here we did it through sound, so seeing with your ears, but we wanted to gain more comparisons to the amount of information you can present through touch. So on the tongue, you can't present as much information as you can through sound. And so we got a better comparison. And what was interesting is we found that performance was above chance in all cases. So people could learn to recognize these objects really well. But performance didn't change very much from these very simple pixelated images down here at the bottom with only 8 by 8 pixels, compared to having these much clearer images, 32 by 32 pixels. So in many ways, having poor resolution is fine for being able to recognize these sorts of images. And it was interesting because this goes back to the justification Acuity had when he created the tongue device, the brain port, where he noted that although it cannot perceive as much information as vision, he didn't think that was a serious barrier to high performance, because what matters is the learning that takes place, and the brain is able to extract the necessary information over time. So even with the tongue device, you find people can recognize things and interact with things quite well. So reducing information seems to be one solution. But there are other possible solutions as well. One such solution is adding even more multisensory information. So I described early on the way we navigate the world and the way a lot of people fear that if they became visually impaired, they would lose their ability to walk through the world as easily as they do now. And it's true, it's much more challenging. But by providing other ways of accessing information, such as say through a white cane that you might see a visually impaired person using, they're able to access information they normally would see through touch. And you're able to integrate that with proprioception, your self-motion,
in a way that allows you to interact with the world. And so here we wanted to see how efficiently people could use sensory substitution devices, such as seeing with their ears or seeing with their tongue, and combine that with self-motion in a navigation type task. And so we have Crescent Jickle and Typhoon Esenkaya, who both collaborated on this work. Both of them were PhD students at the University of Bath. And we did this work with motion tracking. So we would be able to track where people moved in the environment and which way they would turn with these cameras. And so the sort of tasks we gave them were looking at how people use different reference frames for knowing where things are. They either had an egocentric task, so they had to walk to a target position relative to their starting point in the room. So we always had a starting point in one corner, and we moved the other objects around from trial to trial. And they would either go from their starting point to a location they hadn't walked to before, like they would just walk between these three and then be taken back and then be tested on the location of that third object. Or they were asked to instead start at a different location and still find their way to that object, which is called an allocentric task. So egocentric essentially means knowing where things are relative to our own egocentric perspective. Allocentric means being able to know where things are relative to one another, which is the sort of processing that's required for making a map. So a map gives you this bird's eye view, this view from the sky of where things are related to one another. Whereas if you were to give someone directions to get from, say, one building to another on your campus, you might describe, well, you start here facing this way, then you go forward, then left, then right, then left, then forward, and you're there. So that's sort of an egocentric perspective to give people a route. So we tested basically this route-based knowledge versus a map-like knowledge. And just to give you an example, people had to go through lots of training to learn to use the device that turned images into sound. So they did training with the voice. And we did this with motion tracking throughout to see how well they could do it and how well they could either learn the locations without moving compared to learning the locations with their body movement. Now, the main thing I want to focus on, so there's sort of a lot of data here. What I mostly want you to understand is that we measured how accurate people were at the location relative to this in the middle here. So this 0 position XY is perfect. That means they knew exactly where the object was. So where these dots appear and all these stars tell you how wrong people were in different groups. And so in these different groups, we either had just self-motion, sort of shown in blue here. We had the voice, this device that turned images into sound, shown in yellow. And then they used both together in black. And so you can get an idea of sort of the variety of differences we would get. And we would look at the variance in their responses to where the object was for the different conditions, self-motion, using the device, the voice, using them both together. And we can use a model to calculate the ideal performance if they combine both really well. And so what we found is for the visually impaired condition, we found the visually impaired people were able to combine them, this black case, better than expected. So better than each one individually, self-motion and the voice, they were able to combine them and get even more out of it, more than the sum of its parts, sort of like a gestalt that you might hear about in perception. And the sighted were able to do about as well as we expected. So they weren't quite as good at self-motion. They were better, I'm sorry, at self-motion. They weren't quite as good at using the voice device where they hear the images, but they were able to perform at using their combination as well as expected. So one thing we thought about is, so we have this device that turns images into sound. We also have this device that turns images into something you feel on your tongue, can we use the best of hearing and the best of touch to help people see even better? Can we provide even more multisensory information to them? And so we tried combining the auditory device with the BrainPort tongue device. So for this, we found, and this is again looking at this allocentric task of knowing where objects are related to one another, like a map, or egocentric, so knowing like the route between the objects. And we found both cases, people could combine them fairly well. Again, we want to compare this model here, which is the last column, to the combination here next to it of using both the auditory device and the tongue device. And what we found is that in the allocentric condition, actually, people weren't able to combine them very well. So in doing this task of sort of having a mental map of where things were, they were better at using each device on its own. The egocentric, they're able to perform as well as expected, though. So from a single perspective, looking back and forth at the objects, they could figure out the route. But knowing where the objects were related to one another didn't quite work as we had hoped. So combining didn't work. And we can see that here as well. So again, this allocentric condition, comparing the combination of the devices with the others. And they were actually much better at just using the auditory device than the combination of the two. So like adding the tongue information seemed to make it harder for them. So it didn't seem to help to have the two devices at once in this case. But trying to figure out why that is interesting, and something we've done some additional work on in noting that one problem was that the information's not aligned properly. So you're trying to convert these images, if you remember from the very beginning, like you have the letters presented on the tongue, and it's unclear which way they're facing. So if you're trying to deal with that and with the sound, which is presenting the information in a way consistent with the camera, that might just provide too much work for people and be too confusing to convert what they're feeling on their tongue to what they're hearing. And again, it goes back to some of these other problems too. So the voice and being able to present information through sound can provide very rich information in the image. We can present closer to that 10 to the 4 limit of bits per second through the voice by turning pixels into notes, so high pitch versus low pitch again. But the tongue device does not have the ability to represent as many pixels on the tongue. The original tongue display unit only could show 144 pixels. The BrainPort we used in the last study could show 396 pixels. But that's still far less than the 25,000 pixels that the voice can play through sound. So making those matches are really hard. And that's just in terms of the technical ability of the device. We've also done tests of human visual like acuity, like the sort you would do if you went to the eye doctor to get a pair of glasses or lenses. And we've made these comparisons. So we have the two we've tested down here at the bottom to other forms of techniques to restore vision. Particularly, these are all invasive forms. So either stem cells where you have surgery or a cortical implant. So people actually get a camera that provides stimulation directly to the brain. Or these two forms of eye implants where you have electrodes going into the eye to give them a sense of vision. Now, these devices that allow you to see with your ears or your tongue are much cheaper, and they're not invasive like the other ones. But also what's really interesting is their acuity. So the ability of people to do the eye doctor test is actually really good. So the smaller the number, so normal vision that you try to have with glasses is 20/20. The voice, actually, the auditory device, we found the best performance compared to any of the invasive surgical procedures that people can get. They can get to 20/200. Now, the tongue device gets much lower than all of them. But one aspect it does give you is the rapid sense of motion. So you can present the images in real time on the tongue, which people can use for other sorts of tasks. But in terms of the eye doctor task, it's definitely not quite as strong as the auditory device. So in rethinking the experiment, we're using the tongue device with the hearing device, the voice and the brain port together. Didn't seem to help, but seemed to confuse them. We realized that ultimately the problem is they weren't able to align the information together easily. So to get around that, because we're using a task for people walked around in a room, we created a prototype where we had one camera providing the information to both the tongue and to the ears, so that they were aligned perfectly with the single camera and at the same resolution. So instead of the ears getting a lot more information than the tongue, we gave them the exact same number of pixels matched in exactly the same way. And so we had a basic task of recognizing letters and shapes. And here we found something startlingly different. So people were able to perform better than chance in all cases. So you can learn to see with your ears and with your tongue. But performance was actually lowest in this case for hearing. It was higher for the tongue. But the best performance was using the two of them together. And so we can actually find providing more multisensory information through touch and hearing at the same time can work, but we need to make sure we're presenting the same thing to each sense. So when we integrate it, they are matching up with the same thing. So we were able to finally find better performance through using both seeing with the tongue and ears at the same time, but only if things match up. So again, what was different? Well, multisensory processing works better when you have spatial and temporal congruence. So when things match where they are and the timing of presentation. And this box prototype allowed us to do that. And so the two devices were also given equal levels of information input, which gives you more of a chance to give them equal weight when you average them together. And so that's what seemed to help allow you to get this multisensory cooperation. So we've also, throughout all of our studies, been really interested in the experience of people using these devices. So being cognitive psychologists, we do a lot of numerical measurements, but we also like to ask them about the qualitative experience that they have. And I like this one that I highlighted here. That one participant mentioned specifically, they initially felt like the combination made it more difficult to identify the shapes and letters. So they began to separate the two devices out, paying attention to the sound to get an overall idea of the shape. And then they confirmed the details with their tongue. So they seem to be using them in a way of sort of switching their attention, getting past this capacity limitation, which seems to exist across the senses. And rather than simultaneously addressing both, starting with one, what they were hearing, and then switching their attention to what they were feeling on their tongue to finally figure out what was being presented in the image. So perhaps one way we can get around the problem of vision handling so much information is to allow us to not only substitute one other sense, but to allow more than one sense to divide up the work and work together to cooperate to figure out these sensory problems. And just a note, so if you are interested in the ways you can take advantage of multisensory information in an applied way, so to sort of take this information about cross-modal correspondences and this form of synthetic synesthesia and make it useful for people, like people who are blind. We do have a paper that just came out last year describing the principles you need to understand and how you can design things in a way that anyone can take advantage of. Now, I want to get back to some of these fundamental issues of the brain before I finish. So at the beginning, I asked you, what does it mean to see? And I noted that, depending on who you ask, you might get a different answer. A psychologist might answer one way, A physicist might answer from a perspective of optics. A neuroscientist might tell you about the steps the information goes through. And I think the how part, the steps that take place in neuroscience, are incredibly fascinating, something we've written about quite a bit. And which is completely fascinating from the perspective of understanding this form of synthetic synesthesia. And it's remembering this idea that when we see, yes, the eyes might provide the information, but as I've told you, we can substitute that information by turning images into something we can hear or touch. And so what is ultimately important is that we see with the brain, and it doesn't necessarily matter where the information is coming from. So when people first learn the voice, so they learn to hear images as sounds, they initially, of course, are going to process the information in areas that are known for auditory processing. So primary and secondary auditory areas are located in the temporal lobes, laterally in the brain, so on the sides here. But as participants, such as these blind participants, learn to use the device, something happens. You see a transformation where the information is not just processed as sound alone anymore, but starts to take advantage back in the occipital lobe, so the back of the brain in the posterior here of the head, where the visual cortex that otherwise isn't receiving visual information because they have damage to their eyes, is suddenly being used to allow them to process the sounds in a way they can see, similar to what you see with synesthesia. So although people might just be hearing music, if they start seeing colored shapes, it's because something is activating the visual parts of their brain to give rise to this synesthetic experience, this cross-modal correspondence, where you're really only sensing something externally with one sense, like sound, but internally, you have this concurrent experience of something else, like vision. So just some key ideas and findings to remember that are fundamental to psychology and the sorts of things that you're studying in this subject at university. Well, first of all, a fundamental issue that you see throughout all of these experiments is there can be too much of a good thing. Human information capacity limitations keep us from processing everything at once. That's why we have attention, this perceptual selectivity, so we only process some of it at a time in order to deal with how overwhelming it is. We can't process everything in vision or everything from all of our senses at the same time. We really have to break it down into smaller parts. So sometimes less is more. Although the world provides this embarrassment of sensory riches, so much information to all of our senses at any one time, we don't really need all of it. So even if we present people with these pixelated images they can feel on their tongue or hear, they can still learn to recognize objects as they might do with vision. So we can get by with less information than is actually out there. To do that, multisensory cooperation might be just as crucial as integration. So these cross-modal correspondences, this ability to take information from, say, hearing and touch in order to provide a visual-like experience to someone is possible. But as we outline in a paper on this topic, it's really important that things line up spatially and temporally, and that you really have things in a way that people can use their senses in cooperation with one another, particularly for someone who has a visual impairment. And ultimately, the really important thing for thinking about all of our sort of experience in psychology and synesthesia and perception is that we perceive with the brain, not with our various sensory receptors. And that's important for just understanding how perception works, but it also means we can take advantage of how perception works to apply it to things like visual impairments and blindness, to hearing impairments and deafness, potentially to motor impairments, tactile impairments. Really, it just opens up the number of things we can possibly do with psychology and a little help from technology to be able to find ways to apply our knowledge in a way that helps other people. So terima kasih. Thank you so much for your attention and your participation. I do hope we have enough time now for any questions you might have, any questions at all, or any discussion or ideas that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prue. That was very insightful. We've taught them actually a little bit about synesthesia, but it was rather fleeting. So it was only briefly mentioned. So that was very insightful. And I'm sure all of the students here appreciate what they've learned from you so far. So should we just go ahead and start with the question and answer session? All right, so students, sorry if I switch back and forth between Indonesian and English. Ada yang mau tanya? Kalau ada yang mau tanya, silakan. If there are any questions, you may either type it in the chat box or Hafiz from Class C. Would you like to say it directly to the audience here?
Ya, boleh.
Silakan. Mau pakai bahasa Inggris, bahasa Indonesia, Hafiz?
Pakai bahasa Inggris juga. So, Dr. Prue, I would like to ask, do you think technology, as it's advancing thus far, will get to the point where people that's born blind will be allowed to see the world via like a chip or similar methods? And if so, how long do you reckon would it take for technology to advance that far?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, how long will it take for technology to allow a person born blind to be able to see, with like a simple chip, an implant, or some other technological perspective? And we really have some fundamental challenges in psychology and neuroscience we need to solve first. So a lot of this information about how the brain is able to take new information, whether it's coming from an implant or from sound or from touch, and to be able to use that in a way that it naturally would use visual information is a big gap in our knowledge. So a lot of things I described are still at the edge of what we know now, and we still need to know more about how we're able to process that information psychologically and how the brain is able to do it. In some ways, we keep getting closer, but I feel like we're just making small incremental improvements. All of the approaches I described, including the implants here, the implants in the eye or in the brain, require a lot of practice, a lot of learning, a lot of training. And most people find it very hard to take the time to learn something to that level of expertise that's necessary to take full advantage of it. And so we really have just some fundamental things we need to figure out about learning, particularly perceptual learning, I think, to get past that challenge. And I guess right now, my best estimate would be that it could happen in a year if a student like yourself suddenly has insight into what we need to study to figure that out. Or it could take 20 years until the technology gets good enough to get us around some of those issues. Because like right now, the implants and such just aren't good enough yet. Our auditory device, which is really cheap, does much better than those very expensive, very invasive implants. But we're just doing it on our very fundamental information about how we can translate what we see into what we hear. And so, yeah, I think we're still perhaps a couple decades away until someone really gets an insight that gets us further.
Did that answer your question, Hafiz?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prue. Would anyone else like to ask a question? Class B, Laurentius, go ahead.
Okay, so hello, Mr. Prue. I'm so happy to have you here. And I want to ask, so I watched a show. There was a boy who can see without eyes because he used echolocation, if I'm not mistaken. So like he just tickle his tongues, yeah. So like, and then he can detect the things around him. So like he can play bicycle, ride bicycle, and can play basket. just by tickling his tongue. And what do you think about him? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. And yes, so there's one person in particular who's famous. So he might be the one you saw in that show, named Daniel Kish. And he taught himself how to do echolocation exactly as you described. That was perfect. So he makes these clicks with his tongue, and he can hear the echo off the things around him to know what is where. So the amount of information he can get is much lower than what we can get from some of these other devices, but it's good enough that he can avoid large obstacles. So yes, there's a good example of him riding a bike. So if you look up human echolocation, you can see him riding a bike. And so large cars he can avoid very well. And that's good enough, you know, because he can pick up on his movement through space and be able to do that. But he can't do, you know, very fine, small objects necessarily. So finding maybe a pen on a table would be very hard because the echoes can't resolve that level of spatial information. And he can't pick up on things that are completely flat. So like on my mug here, you know, it says something about, you know, having a cup of tea. The echoes have nothing to bounce off of, right? It's a flat surface. So he can find the mug, but the other devices can pick up on the shapes and the letters that are on the mug. But what's nice about his echolocation is it does give him a lot of freedom because he can walk and find a doorway. He can find if there's a tree in front of him and make his way around it, which is fascinating. And he's helped out some researchers. So particularly there's some neuroscientists up in Durham in Northern England who have looked at activity in his brain. And like the image I showed you, where you can see activity in the visual part of the brain when listening to my auditory device, the same thing happens when he listens to his own echoes. So he seems to be having this visual image that's being formed in his brain of what he's able to hear through his tongue clicks, which is, yeah, absolutely fascinating. And I think allows this connection between this idea of having this fake form of synesthesia that we're able to induce in people. And you can even do it by essentially seeing how a bat can see, you know, with using these echolocation approach.
That answer your question, Laurentius?
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Brooks.
All right. So we have right after Laurentius, Nabila was raising her hand. Nabila, you can go ahead, and then after that we have one more person who wants to ask a question. Go ahead, Nabila.
Okay, thank you so much. So I want to ask you questions. So you talk about synthetic synesthesia, right? So I guess brain plays a really important role here. And then does it mean that people with cortical blindness will never ever get the benefit from this technology or from this technology? And if yes, they will not get the benefit from this technology, do you think that like in the future there will be a technology that will allow them to see, you know, like will allow them to see? Or is it like it will totally impossible for them to see regardless of the sophistication of the technology?
Yeah, that is a great question. So yes, certainly a lot of the cases I described are people who have a peripheral blindness rather than a cortical blindness. And so cortical blindness can be very common throughout the lifespan. So children are born with cortical visual impairment. And people, when they get much older, might have a stroke, which can damage different regions of the brain. And if it damages, you know, parts of the visual cortex, then they will become cortically visually impaired at that point as well. And an important topic related to this and understanding of what it means to see is research on blind sight. So originally a lot of work by Larry Wiesenkrantz, but later on by Petra Sturig and Alan Cooey, examined in both human patients but also experimental work they did with monkeys, how having damage to the brain can cause a feeling of blindness, but through training, people can act as if they can see, even though they're not aware of it. So this idea of blind sight came about because you can get a person who says they can't see. I mean, their eyes are still fine. It's just the brain is damaged. But if you ask them to guess, so if you say, okay, reach out and guess where the mug is, and they move it around on the table, and they'll say, I can't see a mug. I can't do it. And you say, just try. And then if the mug's over here, they reach out and they grab it. If the mug's over here, they reach out and they grab it. You ask them, how did you do that? And they say, I have no idea. So they can't see images in their mind, but there's enough visual information going through other parts of the brain that they're able to behave as if they can see. And so these sorts of devices I've described could be used by a person with cortical visual impairment. It would allow them to do this sort of thing of being able to accurately find things in the world based on the information the camera gives. It might allow them to integrate it with what their eyes are able to do. They might never have true synesthesia. They might never say, yes, I can see an image in my head now of what is out there. But it might still help them with what they have to do every day. So it can help with the part of seeing, which is being able to act on the world, but it might not give them the feeling of seeing, if that makes sense. Great question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
That's very
Nabila. That was a great question. I was going to ask that question if she didn't ask that question. Luckily, she did. All right. So I think we have room for one more question, and that's probably it. So Marifel was already raising her hand before. Marifel, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, morning, Mr. Pro. This question is fairly related to Nabila's question, actually. And initially, I wasn't sure if this was entirely related to the topic, but it is something to do with the brain perception to sensory information. So a few weeks ago, I attended a webinar regarding a neuroscience take on abuse victims or trauma victims and the physiological changes that occur. So the speaker mentioned a story about their patient in therapy where they were deaf after a traumatic event. Yet the deafness wasn't exactly due to any physical injury in the ear or even the brain. It was just that the brain blocked itself and could not perceive sound anymore after the traumatic event. So my question is, what happened? Because there wasn't any physiological damage. So how can the brain just simply refuse to work just like that after a shock or a traumatic event? Thank you so much.
Yeah, great question. And especially that example focuses on a sudden sort of psychological deafness that arises from a traumatic event. And you certainly see that happen with the other senses as well. So there are these cases where people become inexplicably blind after a traumatic event as well. So without being able to understand why, they suddenly say they can't see. And it resembles blind sight in that sense. So they can still kind of respond to things around them, but they've lost their experience of it. And for the people like you described, they seem to have lost their experience of hearing as a result. And it is still very controversial for understanding it and particularly knowing how to treat it, because that is such an issue. And I think the best we know now at this point about that, I don't have the easy answer to your question, like how is that possible? But the more complicated answer is that when we have any perceptual experience, it is spread out through the brain in many different ways. So when you hear, for example, you may initially have that information in the primary auditory and secondary auditory cortices, but then it moves on to other areas that are multisensory in nature. So you'll process the spatial aspects of the sound in the parietal lobe, the more identifying aspects of the sound, like say if it's a person's voice, you're recognizing that in the temporal lobe. And so it's distributed throughout the brain. And so something is possibly happening in areas that are more related to emotion or to higher level cognitive capacities, going anywhere from the frontal cortex, where you might have some of these higher level capacities, or going to the amygdala, which you might have had this like shock to the system that then propagates through, for the amygdala, which processes emotional information, a lot of connections to the hippocampus, which is important for memory and spatial processing. And what likely happens is the whole network gets disrupted. And so it might not be one area of the brain that's entirely responsible, but all of the connections that go between all of these regions somehow get disrupted and by that traumatic event. And that's probably what makes it so hard to solve. Right? So just trauma in general can be very difficult for a person, and it's likely because it's presenting throughout the entire brain and not just in any very specific region.
Marvel, did that answer your question?
That did. Thank you so much. So what I take from that is the brain does not work as one singular function that works separately, but they work together. And it's not just perceiving sensory information, but emotions and all that, decision making and all that kind of stuff that are not initially related to sensation actually play a role as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when it goes back to asking people what they might miss when they're blind, that kind of shows. People don't just say, I miss having visual information. They say, I miss seeing a sunset because that makes me happy, and so that it's absolutely tied up with our full psychological experience as humans.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Prue, for your elaborate answers. And I'm pretty sure that the students here are very satisfied with your answers as well. Before we end the session, are there any main takeaway points or main the messages that you would like to reiterate to our freshman class? Because they are freshmen, so this is probably something entirely new to them, although their questions suggest that they are very much interested in the topic. So anything you would like to say, any last message before we end the meeting?
I think the main takeaway message, particularly for freshman psychology students, is that the solutions to a lot of our big problems in the world are not technological. We can't just sort of invent and build our way out of the problems that we have, particularly as people. A lot of the things we need to solve are psychological. We need psychology students like you to be creative, to think across the entire person, all aspects of a person's, psychological makeup. So like this class you're taking, their personality, their perception, their ability to move throughout the world, to really have an appreciation of all of that. And only by better understanding all those processes of perception, of personality, of motor movements, all these different things that make us who we are, we really have to solve those problems in order for the technology to work. And so don't ever let the engineers or the computer scientists trick you into thinking they're doing something harder, because they're not. They're doing something easy. They're just, putting pieces together and plugging things in. The hard part is understanding the brain. And so we need students like you who are focusing on understanding people holistically in order to really find solutions.
Very true. I completely agree with you. Sometimes, especially in Indonesia, we say that psychology is not a science, or a lot of people seem to think that psychology is not a science. Whereas where I studied, and obviously where you live, it is a science. It is it's a behavioral science, but it is science nevertheless. So
absolutely,
so much.
And that's why Facebook asked me to come out here for 2 years.
Exactly. So who else can study virtual reality? I mean, the computer scientists can do it, but who can comprehend the human processing system better than us, right?
Yeah, no one. Yeah, it's
No
all
one.
psychology.
Yes, very true. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Prue. And thank you for joining us and taking the time to leave a little message and share your insights to our freshman class today. So before we end the meeting, would you mind, all of you, would you mind turning on your camera so we can take a picture just for documentation purposes? It's okay if you haven't showered, just turn on the camera. You can't really tell if you haven't showered. Lecturers, who's taking the picture? Is it Janice?
Yes, it will be
Okay.
me.
Mhm.
Okay. So let me count 1 up to 3. Give your best smile or strike a pose. Well, 1 and 2 and 3. Cheers. Okay, wait a moment. I will go to the next slide. Next layer, I mean. 1 and 2 and 3. Cheers. Okay. I guess one more time. Okay. Okay, 1 and 2 and 3. Cheers. Okay. Okay, ma'am, Amanda, I get it.
Yes. All right. Thank you, students, for attending today. So for those of you who haven't filled in the attendance sheet, I think each class's instructor should have given you the form, right? So thank you. This is our last class for the semester, actually. Next week, you're going to have the final exam. So we'll see you at the exam. Why are you smiling?
Good luck with your exams, everyone.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was really amazing.
Yes.
Thank you, Agnes.
It seems like the students are really interested as well.
Yeah,
Because we didn't really teach them a lot about synesthesia.
multisensory or association
Yeah.
cortex. Yeah,
We taught them quite a bit on the visual system, obviously, because that's always the textbook always talks like pages and dedicates pages and
Most
pages
of
on
it,
the visual
yeah.
visual
or
system.
also, yeah, but we also teach them hearing
And
neural networks.
the sensory motor system as well,
Sensory.
but not as extensive as what we taught them about the visual system, obviously.
Yeah.
It was interesting because I always bring up Pharrell Williams as well in my classes. I always tell them, look up this YouTube video. There's an interview with Pharrell where he mentions that he's a synesthete. And I think another one is Lorde, the Australian singer. She was famous a few years back. I think she mentioned in one of her interviews as well. Students, you may leave if you want. Are you eavesdropping?
It's time to leave, everyone.